On the evening of Thursday, March 9, 2006, a 50-year-old woman named Karen Divalbliss sat in the passenger seat of her car. Her husband, 71-year-old Jim Divalbliss, was behind the wheel, driving them through downtown Lancaster, Ohio. Karen looked out the window and watched as they passed historic buildings, shops, and restaurants. Every once in a while, Jim slowed down and waved at people on the sidewalk, because he and Karen knew practically everybody in town. So, Lancaster was a small suburb of about 36,000 people, and it was generally a friendly, blue-collar place. Karen and Jim had lived there for over a decade, and they were well known in the community, mostly because of their business ventures. They owned multiple rental properties around town, and also a store where they sold electronics, toys, and hobby supplies. The properties and the store had not only made Karen and Jim a lot of friends, but also a lot of money. They had a reputation for being very wealthy, but also very generous. They went out of their way to help people who were down on their luck, especially friends and family. Karen's former sister-in-law, whose name was Deanna Smith, had actually been living in one of their rental properties for a long time now, and Karen's son was an employee at their store. But even now, with all of their success and their kindness, Karen knew that a lot of people in town viewed her and Jim as kind of an odd couple. They'd both been married before and had kids from their first marriages, and on paper, they didn't seem like obvious partners. Jim was 21 years older than Karen, and he also tended to be pretty quiet and reserved. Karen, on the other hand, was usually the loudest person in the room. But despite their differences, they just worked, and really that was all that mattered to them. Just then, Karen felt the car slow to a stop. She looked out the window and saw that they were at their first stop of the evening, the hobby store that they owned. There was a big sign outside that said the store's name, D&D Sales. The sign looked exceptionally bright and clean, which should have made Karen happy. But in reality, it actually made her feel kind of annoyed. The sign had recently been repainted by Karen and Jim's regular handyman, and he'd done a great job with it, and Karen had paid him what she owed him for the work. But then, after she paid him, he kept demanding more money. Now, Karen prided herself on being generous, but she'd felt like the handyman was now trying to take advantage of her. So, she had told him that if he wanted to earn more money, she could give him another repair job. Now, ultimately, he had agreed to do another job, but he'd made it very clear that he was not happy about it, and things had been tense between him and Karen ever since. But luckily, the handyman was not at the store that day. Karen was actually here to see somebody else, her 27-year-old son, Jeremy Moore. She could see him inside the shop through the window, manning the front counter. He was tall, skinny, and had dark hair and earrings. Jeremy was her only son from her first marriage, and they usually got along really well. When Karen and Jim first opened D&D Sales, they'd given Jeremy a job, and he'd been a great employee. Karen had felt like she could really trust him, and she'd given him a lot of independence. But then, that all changed, because Jeremy had started getting into serious trouble. He'd never really been a troublemaker, but it was like all of a sudden, he had gotten arrested for stealing. And when he came back to work after that, his performance had majorly slipped. He'd started showing up late or not showing up at all. And on top of that, some of Karen and Jim's other store employees had begun complaining that they didn't like working with him because he was moody and angry. And so this had put Karen in a pretty awkward position because she loved Jeremy and she wanted him to succeed. And family or not, she just wasn't in the habit of firing people or leaving them high and dry when they were having a hard time. But at the same time, she also didn't want Jeremy's attitude and performance to affect her business. So she had sort of made it a point to check in on him while he was working. Karen told Jim she'd be right back, and she got out of the car. She went inside the store and asked her son how he was doing. And he seemed annoyed to be asked and just told her that, everything was fine. So Karen did a quick sweep of the store to make sure all the shelves were stocked and the aisles were clean. Everything looked good, so she went back to the front counter and told Jeremy she loved him, and then headed back outside to the car. A few minutes later, Karen and Jim pulled up to their second stop of the evening, their favorite bowling alley, which was called Tiki Lanes. In addition to being business people, Karen and Jim were avid bowlers. They were in 3 different bowling leagues and came to Tiki Lanes at least a few times a week. In fact, they were so serious about bowling that they'd even hired a coach who they met with for weekly lessons. But for tonight, they were just here to meet with their friends for a couple of casual rounds. Karen and Jim parked the car, walked inside, and went straight to their usual lane. A bunch of their bowling friends were already sitting around tables nearby, and when they saw Karen and Jim, they got up and hugged and said hello. At some point, Karen sat down, put on her bowling shoes, and took several expensive rings off her fingers and stuck them in her pocket so they wouldn't get damaged. Then she got up and got ready to play. Throughout the evening, Jim kept the table stocked with snacks and drinks for the whole group. They ate, they drank, they played, and they talked with their friends. And by the time they were all done, Karen was exhausted. She put her rings back on, changed her shoes, and all she could think about was getting home and going to bed. So she and Jim said goodbye to everyone, then they went outside, hopped in their car, and headed home. About 10 minutes later, they pulled into their driveway. They lived in a big brick house in a rural area north of town, so the neighborhood was quiet and scenic. Karen got out of the car and was about to walk to the door, but she stopped when she heard a voice call out to her from behind her. She turned around and she gasped. Four days later, around 9 a.m. on Monday, March 13th, Karen's son, Jeremy, pulled up outside his mother and stepfather's house. He parked his red sedan, then got out and walked towards the front door. So normally, at this time, Jeremy would be opening up the family store, D&D Sales. But he'd asked another person to keep an eye on the store because he needed to go see his mom. He had a routine of calling her every morning when he got to work. But that morning, when he'd called, she hadn't picked up, which was unusual. And then Jeremy realized that he actually hadn't spoken to his mother that entire weekend. And normally, they spoke just about every day. So the whole situation made him feel confused and sort of concerned. Jeremy went to the front door and he knocked, but he didn't hear anything inside. Nobody came to the door, and he called out for his mom, but he didn't hear anybody calling him back. So eventually, he reached down and tried the handle, and he discovered it was unlocked. And when he swung the door open, nothing happened, which was also unusual. Jeremy knew his mom and stepdad never left their door unlocked, and they also had an alarm system. So the alarm at this point should have been going off right now, but it wasn't. Once Jeremy was inside, he looked over at the living room, and he saw it had been completely ransacked. Furniture was overturned, and papers and random items were scattered all over the floor. At this point, Jeremy's heart was racing because obviously something was wrong. Instinctively, he just ran down the hallway to his mother and stepfather's bedroom, but when he got there, something inside of him told him not to go all the way into the room. Instead, he sort of peered around the doorframe to barely look inside, and when he did, he saw it was a mess, just like the living room. Drawers had been pulled open, and there were clothes and empty jewelry boxes all over the floor, but also on the floor, in the middle of this mess, Jeremy saw a big red puddle that he immediately knew was blood. And in this puddle, he saw 2 feet. And even though from his vantage point, peering into this room barely, Jeremy couldn't really see anything except those 2 feet, he just had this immediate gut feeling that the feet belonged to his mother and that she had been murdered. Jeremy turned, sprinted out of the house, and called the police. A few minutes later, a young, stocky detective named Scott Jones arrived on the scene, along with several other police officers and a team of forensic investigators. There were so many first responder vehicles crowded around the area that he had to park a squad car a little ways down the road. Detective Jones got out of his car and began walking towards the big brick house he was here to investigate. He had worked for the county sheriff's office for about 4 years, and in that time, he had investigated homicide cases. And he knew how important it was to approach every crime scene with a very open mind, so he was coming in with zero preconceived notions. All he knew at this point was that a few minutes ago, a young man named Jeremy had called in to report the murder of his mother, Karen Divalbliss. He also knew that the big brick house belonged to Karen and her husband Jim. But right now, Detective Jones didn't know where Jim was. Jeremy hadn't said anything about him when he'd called in the report. As Detective Jones walked, he noticed that in the midst of all the emergency response vehicles, there was also a civilian car parked on the road. It was a red sedan, and there was a thin man with dark hair and earrings sitting inside of it. Detective Jones assumed it must be Jeremy. Detective Jones took note of this and just continued towards the home's driveway. There, he met up with a slightly older detective with a handlebar mustache, whose name was Andy Roberts. Detective Jones and Detective Roberts shook hands, and then, together, they approached the front door. Detective Jones noticed that the door did not look damaged at all, like it had not been pried or broken open. In fact, there were no signs of forced entry anywhere. To Detective Jones, this meant that whoever killed Karen either had a key to the house or Karen had let them inside. And so this suggested that she had some kind of personal relationship with her killer. Still, Detective Jones reminded himself not to jump to any conclusions. He and the other detective went inside and right away saw the living room had been totally ransacked. It looked like a robbery. But again, Jones didn't want to form an opinion before seeing all the evidence. Because the house was so big, the detectives agreed to split up and examine rooms of the house separately. Detective Jones took the bedroom, where he already knew was where the body was located. And when he got there, he saw the room was a total disaster, just like the living room, and on the floor, he saw Karen Divalbliss, lying face down in a pool of blood. The detective could see her body was covered in dozens of stab wounds, and when Jones leaned down for a better look, he saw that she also had cuts all over her hands. This told the detective two things. First, whoever killed Karen did so in a particularly violent and aggressive way, which suggested they were extremely upset with her. And the defensive wounds on Karen's hands suggested that she very likely fought back against her attacker. And so at this point, Detective Jones began to wonder about Jim, Karen's husband. He knew that, statistically, women were most likely to be killed by their intimate partners. So it seemed possible that Jim might have murdered Karen, then staged the house to look like it had been robbed, and then he fled. Detective Jones began asking the crime scene techs to take photos of Karen's body, as well as the empty jewelry boxes all around the room. And as he was doing this, suddenly, he heard Detective Roberts call out to him from a different part of the house. He sounded startled, and he yelled for Detective Jones to hurry. Seconds later, Detective Jones was standing by Roberts as they both stared down a set of stairs into the basement. And lying at the bottom of those stairs, they could see there was a second body. When they went down the stairs, the detective saw that the body belonged to a man. He was on his back, and he had also been stabbed dozens of times. And he was just around the corner from a closet which had an empty, open safe inside of it. Detective Jones realized that they had just found Karen Divalbliss's husband, Jim. And so this made his earlier idea that maybe Jim had killed his wife Karen seem highly unlikely. And even though he still didn't want to jump to conclusions, a theory was already beginning to take shape in his mind. Based on the missing jewelry, the open safe, and the ransacked home, this was most likely a real robbery that had gone horribly wrong. But Detective Jones was hung up on one detail. There was no evidence of forced entry into the house. So, the perpetrator either had access to the home, possibly with a key, or Karen or Jim had opened the door for their killer. After he was done investigating the crime scene, Detective Jones went outside to speak to the 911 caller, who was sitting inside of his car. The man, who appeared very shaken, confirmed that his name was Jeremy Moore and that the woman inside was his mother. Detective Jones informed Jeremy that his stepfather, Jim, was also found dead inside of the home. And when Jeremy heard this, he just went silent and kind of stared off into space. Detective Jones couldn't tell if he was shocked or just pretending to be. So, he asked Jeremy why he'd come to his parents' house that day. Jeremy said that when he'd gone into work that morning, he had called his mother to check in, like he always did, but she hadn't answered. He also said the last time he had seen his mom was 4 days earlier, on Thursday evening, when she and Jim had stopped by the hobby store on their way to go bowling at Tiki Lanes. Detective Jones then asked Jeremy about the contents of the house and what might have been taken. Jeremy told him that his mother did have a lot of jewelry, but he didn't know where she kept it all. And he also said he had no idea who would have done something like this. Detective Jones knew that it was way too soon to confirm or eliminate Jeremy as a suspect. He also didn't know when the couple had died, so he couldn't determine if Jeremy had an alibi yet. So for now, he told Jeremy he was free to go. Detective Jones watched Jeremy drive away, then he went back to the driveway to speak with Detective Roberts. They both agreed to keep an eye on Jeremy, but they also wanted to send a team of investigators to speak to neighbors and ask if anybody had seen or heard anything strange over the last few days. And while they did that, Jones decided he would go check out the bowling alley that Jeremy had mentioned. Later that day, Detective Jones walked inside of Tiki Lanes. He hoped the staff there would have some information for him, because so far, the investigative team had not gotten much from Karen and Jim's neighbors. Everyone they had spoken to had said they hadn't seen or heard anything weird, and they also hadn't seen Karen or Jim all weekend. Detective Jones went up to the front desk and explained why he was there, and a few of the employees said that they did know Karen and Jim, and they agreed to sit down with the detective and answer his questions. From these interviews, Detective Jones learned that Karen and Jim were regulars at Tiki Lanes, and they were avid bowlers who'd hired a coach to improve their game. He also found out that Karen typically wore a lot of rings on her fingers, which was actually pretty significant to him, because she wasn't wearing any rings when she was found. Whoever had killed her very likely had taken them right off her hands. Lastly, everyone Detective Jones spoke to at the bowling alley said that the last time they'd seen the couple was Thursday night. That was also the last time that Jeremy reported seeing them as well. So for now, Detective Jones decided to operate under the assumption that Karen and Jim had been killed Thursday, sometime after they had bowled at Tiki Lanes. And so based on that, he decided to call Jeremy in for a formal interview to ask him what he had done after he had left work on Thursday evening. The next day, Detective Jones sat in front of his computer inside of his office at the police station while he waited for Jeremy to show up for his interview. He was preparing for the interview by doing some research about Jeremy. Based on interviews the rest of the investigative team had done with Karen and Jim's friends, neighbors, and family members, Detective Jones had already learned a couple of very interesting things. First, Jeremy had reportedly stolen money and other items from Karen in the past. Second, Jeremy was in Karen's will and was going to inherit a lot of money now that she was dead. In the detective's mind, this seemed like a pretty clear motive for murder. It also struck him as very suspicious that Jeremy had been the one who found Karen's body and called the police. Detective Jones knew that it wasn't uncommon for murderers to return to the scene of a crime and to literally insert themselves into the investigation. Now, on his computer, Detective Jones pulled up Jeremy's criminal record and scanned through his previous charges. He saw that Jeremy had been arrested for theft. Now, the detective knew there was a big difference between stealing and committing murder, but the fact that Jeremy had a documented history of theft and the fact that he was going to inherit a lot of money after his mother died looked really bad for him. So, when Jeremy finally came in for his interview, Detective Jones was very eager to talk to him. He led Jeremy into an interview room and then sat down across from him. And just like the last time they had spoken, Jeremy struck the detective as seeming nervous and emotional. Detective Jones started by asking Jeremy what he had done on Thursday evening, after he'd gotten off from work, and Jeremy said he'd gone straight home. But when Detective Jones asked if anybody could verify that, Jeremy said no one could. So, Detective Jones began pressing him much harder, asking him directly about his history of theft and also his mother's will. Jeremy admitted that he had made some mistakes in the past, but he swore he would never hurt his mother, whether he was in her will or not. He said this whole thing was just as confusing and upsetting for him as it was for everybody else. Now, Detective Jones wasn't sure if he actually believed Jeremy, but he still didn't have any evidence that would allow him to hold Jeremy in custody, so he let Jeremy go. And then once he was gone, the detective began heading back to his office. But on the way there, he ran into his partner, Detective Roberts, who looked excited. Roberts said he'd been going over statements the rest of the investigative team had collected from Karen's siblings, and there was someone that they really needed to speak to. A little while later, Detective Jones listened outside the door of an interrogation room as another detective was sitting with Karen's former sister-in-law, Deanna Smith. Karen's brother, Edgar, had told police about Deanna, who was his ex-wife. Edgar said that Karen had bought him and Deanna a house in Lancaster where they lived with their 2 kids. But when Edgar and Deanna got divorced, Edgar moved out, but Deanna wanted to stay inside of the house. Now, Deanna didn't have a lot of money after the divorce, so Karen had made an agreement with her. She could stay in the house if she paid a small fee each month and then also came to Karen's house weekly and cleaned it. It seemed like a win-win situation, but Deanna almost never showed up to clean Karen's house like she had promised. So eventually, as a result of that, Karen increased her rent, and this had made Deanna really mad and led to a lot of tension between them. And when investigators had spoken to Karen's other siblings, they'd also learned that Deanna loved jewelry and expensive things, even though she really couldn't afford them. So, investigators had brought Deanna in for an interview because someone who loved jewelry and disliked Karen was incredibly suspicious. Plus, if Deanna did periodically clean Karen's house, well, she might have had a key or known the alarm system's security code, which could explain why there was no evidence of forced entry. And so now, Detective Jones stood there in the hallway and listened in. When the investigator in the room asked Deanna about the rent increase and her cleaning arrangement with Karen, Deanna said she didn't have any issues with Karen, which obviously was not true. Deanna also said she did not have a key to Karen's house or know the code to their alarm, which seemed hard to believe if she was supposed to drop by weekly to their house to clean it. It just seemed like Deanna was not being honest. But right now, it was Deanna's word against the rest of Karen's siblings, so police really couldn't hold her. Still, after she had left, Detective Jones kept thinking about the fact that Karen's siblings had really specifically mentioned that Deanna truly loved jewelry. And so if Deanna had stolen Karen's jewelry, she might have kept it, but she also might have pawned it since she needed the money. At this point, the investigative team already knew that Karen had a lot of expensive and unique pieces of jewelry that she typically bought at a specific local store. Authorities were already in touch with the shop owner, who was confident that she would actually recognize most of Karen's items. So, Detective Jones decided to start contacting pawn shops in Lancaster and the surrounding areas to see what jewelry had been sold between last Thursday and now. If any of it turned out to be Karen's, they might be able to find out exactly who had pawned it. On Wednesday, March 15, 2006, so 2 days after Karen and Jim had been found dead, Detective Jones was at his desk when one of his investigators came in and dropped an itemized receipt in front of him. It was from a local pawn shop and was for the sale of an expensive piece of jewelry on Saturday, March 11th, just 2 days after Karen and Jim were killed. And when Detective Jones looked at the bottom of the paper, he gasped. The seller's name was written right there. It was Deanna Smith, Karen's former sister-in-law. Detective Jones felt his heart pounding, but he tried to tell himself to be patient. Before they did anything else, they needed to be absolutely sure that the piece of jewelry Deanna sold actually belonged to Karen. So he told the officers to get the jewelry from the pawn shop, and the next day, Karen's regular jeweler came into the station to look at it. And she determined, beyond a doubt, that it was not Karen's. After the jeweler left, Detective Jones slumped in his desk chair and rubbed his eyes in frustration. Now, the fact that this pawn jewelry did not belong to Karen was definitely disappointing, but the detective also didn't think that that proved Deanna was innocent. She clearly needed money, otherwise why would she have pawned one of her own pieces? And they also had a lot of other clues that made her seem suspicious as well. Still, at this point, Detective Jones didn't really know where to turn. A whole team of detectives was investigating the case, but it felt like they just kept hitting dead end after dead end. He was still sure the motivation in this case had to be money. Karen and Jim's house had been ransacked, and a lot of their valuables were missing, like Karen's jewelry. Even the ring she had on her hands had been taken. But the robbery didn't seem random. It had been targeted and deliberate. The killer had been able to access the house without breaking in, which meant they either had a key or Karen and Jim had let them in. And not only that, the couple was killed with such violence, it seemed like the killer was deeply angry with them. And there were 2 people who had a financial motive and potential access to the home: Karen's son, Jeremy, and her ex-sister-in-law, Deanna. But Detective Jones hadn't found any concrete evidence to prove that Jeremy or Deanna had committed this crime. And as he sat there, going over the case in his mind, he knew there were a lot of other people in Karen and Jim's lives that the police had barely even looked into yet. They had friends from the bowling alley, plus multiple employees, tenants, and neighbors that interacted with them regularly. And these people knew Jim and Karen were wealthy. And so basically, Karen and Jim seemed to have some kind of relationship with pretty much everybody in Lancaster. And so Detective Jones had a whole lot more interviewing still left to do. About a week later, so 11 days after Karen and Jim's bodies were found, Detective Jones was sitting in his office feeling frustrated. His team had been going all over town, interviewing basically everybody in Lancaster, and still they had not gotten a single helpful tip. But that afternoon, Detective Jones's phone rang, and the best lead he'd gotten so far seemed to fall right into his lap. It was somebody from his department calling with a very interesting story. They said they'd just gotten a call from a guy who worked at a moving company in town. The employee said that a customer had come in, rented a truck, and paid him in cash a few days ago. And the employee said he had just begun counting their cash payment, and he'd found something the police really needed to see. Detective Jones hung up the phone, grabbed his coat, and headed out to meet this guy. Before long, Detective Jones stood at an office counter across from the moving company employee, and they both were looking down at the cash the employee had mentioned on the phone call. And as Detective Jones was looking at it, he asked the employee to tell him everything he could remember about the person who had given him the cash. And the employee told him that a few days ago, he'd gotten to work early to set up for the day, but when he arrived, there were already some customers lined up by the door. And one of them had been carrying a heavy-looking plastic grocery bag and seemed very antsy to get inside. And they told the employee that they really needed to rent a truck for a move. The employee noticed that the customer looked exhausted and sort of scared. But the weirdest part about this whole encounter was that when it came time for the customer to pay for the rental, they'd opened up their shopping bag and it was full of what looked like thousands of dollars in loose bills. It was definitely weird, but money was money, so the employee had accepted the cash and handed the customer the keys, and they'd gone on their way. It was not until later, when the employee had counted the cash from the sale, that he noticed a lot of the money was covered in blood. Detective Jones couldn't believe it. He asked the employee if he kept records of his customers' names and information. The employee walked over to a file cabinet, pulled out a particular piece of paper, and handed it to Detective Jones. It was a contract that all customers had to sign in order to rent a moving truck. And written on that contract was a name and an address. Detective Jones rushed back to the station and pored over the evidence once again. He wanted to make sure that every piece of information they had lined up with the person whose name was on that contract. And as far as he could see, it did. So he and Detective Roberts, along with some backup, went to the address the moving company had given them. And when they got there, they saw it was a mobile home. They charged up to the door and loudly announced themselves. Seconds later, the door opened, and the detectives saw not one, but two people standing in the doorway. And when Detective Jones looked behind these people into the mobile home, he knew immediately that these were the people who had killed Karen and Jim Divalbliss. Based on later confessions and evidence collected by investigators, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Karen and Jim Divalbliss on March 9th, 2006. That evening, the killer was riding in the back seat of a car with a few other people. In one hand, they were holding a plastic grocery bag, and in their other hand, they were clutching a large kitchen knife. They were on their way to Karen and Jim's house. The killer had been planning to rob the couple for a while now. They'd even asked an accomplice to join them. And now, one of their friends was driving them and their accomplice to the house. But as they got closer to the big brick home, the killer saw that all the lights were off and there was no car in the driveway. Karen and Jim weren't home. And this was actually a big problem. The killer needed Karen and Jim to be home because they had an alarm system that would go off if the killer tried to break in. The killer also needed Jim and Karen around to open up their safe, which they knew was in the basement. And so now, since they weren't home, the killer decided the plan wouldn't work and they should just forget about it. So they told their friend who was driving to turn around. But as they began to drive away, they saw Karen and Jim pass them on the road, headed towards their house. At this point, the killer realized they could still go through with their plan. So they told the driver to turn around again. And a few moments later, they pulled up in front of the house, and the killer and the accomplice jumped out right as Karen and Jim were walking up their driveway. The killer called out to the couple, and when they turned around, the killer held up the knife. They told Karen and Jim to let them and their accomplice inside the house or else. Karen and Jim were obviously terrified, so they did what the killer said. They went inside, and then the killer led Jim downstairs to the safe, while the accomplice stayed upstairs and kept an eye on Karen. When the killer and Jim got to the safe, the killer held up the knife again and told Jim to open it. Jim did, and then the killer grabbed all the money that was inside and began shoving it into the grocery bag. But at some point, Jim tried to get away, and the killer knew they couldn't let him, or they'd be caught in the middle of this robbery. So they didn't stop to think, they just started stabbing Jim over and over until he stopped moving. After that, the killer calmly walked upstairs, where they found Karen and the accomplice, and they demanded that Karen show them where she kept her jewelry. When Karen said it was in her bedroom, the killer brought her in there. But at some point, Karen began to struggle with the killer and was knocked to the floor. And after that, the accomplice held on to Karen as the killer stabbed her over and over again. Karen did try to fight back, but it was too much, and eventually she also died. The killer and their accomplice spent the next hour raiding the home for valuables. When they got all they could carry, they ran back to the car waiting outside and fled with thousands and thousands of dollars in cash, jewelry, and antiques. The killer was not Karen's former sister-in-law, Deanna, and it wasn't Karen's son, Jeremy. It was somebody else who did regularly work for the couple, and who'd recently had an argument with them over how much money they were owed. The killer was Karen and Jim's handyman, 26-year-old Eric Hockman. Eric had done a lot of odd jobs for the couple, including recently painting their store sign. But when Karen paid him for that work, Eric felt like she had given him less than he was owed. And this infuriated him, because he knew that Karen and Jim had a ton of money, and also they had a lot of expensive things, and he knew this because he had done work at their house and seen these things. So he started planning a robbery. He asked a friend to give him a ride, and then also enlisted his girlfriend, 29-year-old Heidi Kidwell, to be his accomplice. The friend agreed, and also Heidi agreed, possibly because she was in the middle of a 3-week heroin high and was not thinking clearly. After the murders, Eric and Heidi laid low for a few days. Then, about 3 days after Karen and Jim's bodies were found, they rented a moving truck and left town. But their big mistake was paying for their rental with cash they had stolen from Karen and Jim, cash that was covered in the couple's blood. The moving company employee led the police straight to Eric and Heidi's new address, which was over 1,000 miles away in Key Largo, Florida. When authorities searched Eric and Heidi's mobile home there, they found thousands of dollars in cash, along with expensive antiques, watches, and jewelry that was later identified as belonging to Karen. Eric and Heidi were both arrested and taken back to Ohio. Heidi pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Eric was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He also received 67 additional years for kidnapping, aggravated burglary, tampering with evidence, and theft from an elderly person. The person who drove Eric and Heidi to commit the murders was never charged. Eric would die by suicide in jail in 2019. Heidi was released from prison in 2020 and passed away 2 years later at age 45. By the beginning of 2016, everybody who lived in apartment building number 12 on Shanxi Road in the big Chinese city of Xi'an knew to stay away from the woman who lived at the end of the hall on the 15th floor. Now, they didn't know much about this woman, but what they did know about her was totally bizarre and kind of alarming. The woman, whose family name was Wu, but nobody actually knew this woman's individual name, was 43 years old and she lived alone. And from what residents could tell, nobody ever came to visit her, and she almost never left her apartment. But oftentimes, residents on the 15th floor could hear this woman talking to herself very animatedly inside of her apartment, and sometimes she'd even get into these big arguments with herself, where it was clear she was kind of playing the role of multiple personalities at once. But none of these things were the reason why people avoided her altogether. They avoided her because she seemed really dangerous. One day, a few months earlier, a teenage girl was walking down the hallway on the 15th floor, making her way towards her friend's apartment, when she passed by this woman's apartment door. And as soon as she walked past, the door to this woman's apartment flew open, and the woman rushed outside and began screaming incoherently. And so this teenage girl, she whips around and sees this woman, and instinctively what this girl thought was, oh my goodness, this woman is being attacked. She's running away from somebody in her apartment or something. But then very quickly it became apparent that this woman was not being attacked. She was attacking the teenage girl. So this woman, she looks at the girl and her eyes go wide and she kind of curls her hands into claws. And then she began running down the hall towards this girl. And so the girl, she begins to scream and she turns and she runs down the hall and she manages to pound on her friend's door. And her friend happened to be right behind the door. They opened it up, the girl ran inside, and they shut and locked the door right as this woman came barreling into the door. And this behavior from this woman on the 15th floor was just the beginning. Following this first attack, the woman on the 15th floor would routinely barge out of her apartment and chase down young women and teenage girls that were walking past her door. Now, this woman never actually hurt anyone that she chased down and even reached in time. She just kind of scared them. And so as a result, the residents of this apartment building, including the women and young girls who had been attacked by this woman, their reaction to this was not anger or resentment or, some desire to go call the police and have this woman arrested. Instead, the residents of this building just kind of felt bad for this woman. It seemed very obvious that she was mentally unwell and probably very lonely, and so they kind of collectively decided to not call the police and instead just kind of ignore her. But sometime in early February, this woman's random attacks on young women and girls just kind of stopped. And at first, residents, especially of the 15th floor of this apartment building, were just relieved because all of a sudden you could walk down that hallway in peace again. But by the end of February, it dawned on people who lived in this apartment building that not only had this woman stopped her random attacks, but also now they couldn't even hear her inside of her apartment talking to herself because that was something people always heard, and now her apartment was totally silent. And so pretty quickly, people became kind of worried about this woman. But nobody was willing to go knock on her door and actually make sure she was okay, because again, this woman was viewed as being kind of dangerous. I mean, she was literally jumping out of her apartment and attacking random passerbys, and so people just continued to keep their distance from this woman. And so as people did that, they began to tell themselves that, probably she just moved out without anybody noticing, and that's why she's gone quiet. But it would turn out that was not the case. Right around the time the woman on the 15th floor stopped her attacks and went silent, sometime in early February, an elevator inside of this apartment building broke down between floors 11 and 10. And so a maintenance crew was called out to fix the elevator, but when they got there, they realized they didn't have the supplies or the manpower to actually make the fix, and so a decision was made to just cut the power to this individual elevator car, and then the work crew said they'd come back in about a month when they had the right supplies and people. And sure enough, a month later, this crew came back with what they needed, and they were able to lower the broken elevator car down to floor 10, and then they opened up the doors, and they were absolutely horrified at what they saw inside of that car. It's believed that shortly after this woman on the 15th floor had one of her outbreaks and chased someone down the hall, she got into the elevator and began traveling down. And when the elevator car got between floors 11 and 10, it came to a lurching stop. But for some reason, when this happened, the woman did nothing. She didn't yell for help, she didn't scream, she didn't pound on the doors, she didn't press any buttons. She just sat in the elevator car in absolute silence. And so eventually it was discovered that one of the elevator cars in this apartment building was broken, not because the woman had called out, but probably because someone had tried to hail the elevator and it didn't come down. And so that maintenance crew was called out, but they couldn't make the repair, and so they decided to cut the power to that car and come back in a month. Now, this elevator crew had no idea there was anybody inside the elevator car because, again, this woman who was trapped in there was totally silent throughout their attempts to try to fix the car. And so after these workers cut the power to this elevator car and left, this woman was doomed. This woman just sat in silence in this elevator car with no food and no water for several days until she died of dehydration, which is one of the most agonizing and slow ways to go. Now, at some point, this woman did attempt to free herself, because there were scratch marks inside the elevator indicating that she had tried to claw her way out, and her hands were totally mutilated, suggesting she really had been clawing pretty hard. But that was the only time she tried to save herself. Otherwise, she just sat there and eventually died. Our next story is called Rabbit Hole. On January 1st, 2015, a family in South Yorkshire, England, gathered at a restaurant for their annual New Year's Day lunch. But one member of this family who said they would be attending didn't show up. It was 50-year-old Stephen Winfrey, who was an unemployed, divorced father of two, who in recent years had become quite depressed. When they reached out to him on his phone and he didn't pick up, the family pretty quickly started to worry that something could have happened to him, that, perhaps he did something to harm himself given his mental state. But his sister, Nadine, who was at this lunch, she reassured the rest of the family that she had spoken to Stephen the night before, and he was in great spirits and had told her that his plan was to go rabbit hunting the next day on New Year's Day before heading over to the restaurant for lunch. And because Nadine knew that her brother recently had really taken a liking to rabbit hunting, it was one of the very few things that actually made him happy, she told the family, look, I bet you anything he just lost track of time and he will get here late, or maybe we won't see him at all, but at least he's out doing something that makes him happy. And so the family was reassured by this, and so they sat down at their table, they ordered their food, and the whole meal, everyone's kind of looking over at the front door, expecting Stephen to come strolling in at any minute. But when they finished up eating, he still had not arrived. And so as the family was getting ready to leave the restaurant and head back home, they all decided that, you know what, I'm sure Stephen is fine, he's doing something he loves, I'm sure he did just get carried away, and so we'll just wait for him to contact us. And so the family, they all leave the restaurant and they spend the rest of the day at their respective households. And then the following morning, they all get in touch with each other and they discover that still no one has seen or heard from Stephen. And so at this point, the family just felt like there was something off about this. And so they contacted the police and they reported him missing. As the police were getting ready to head out and begin looking for Stephen that day, they received a call. Stephen had been found. Although the exact details of what happened to Stephen may never be fully understood, this is the best theory that the police have come up with. On New Year's Day, January 1st, the day Stephen was supposed to meet his family for lunch, he had gotten up early and headed out to a nearby forested park to do some rabbit hunting, just like he told his sister he would be. He had gone to the park with his dog and some ferrets. The way Stephen caught rabbits is he would release these ferrets into various rabbit holes, and then he would stand back with his rifle and he would wait for the ferret to run the rabbits out of their holes, out into the open, and then he would raise his rifle and shoot at the rabbits, and then his dog would run over and grab the rabbit and bring it back to him. And so all morning long, he was doing this with relative success, and then something happened to where Stephen decided he needed to actually look inside of one of these rabbit holes. Perhaps one of his ferrets got stuck, or one of the rabbits got stuck, but either way, he wanted to look into the opening of one of these rabbit holes, and so he walked over to it, and apparently he couldn't quite see whatever it was he wanted to see, and so he got down on his hands and knees and stuck his head into this rabbit hole opening. Now, these openings to these rabbit holes are pretty narrow, and so once he forced his head inside, it got stuck. He could not pull it out again. And so all around the outside of this hole where his head was stuck, there were these deep divots that his hands had obviously dug once he realized he was stuck, because he was trying to dig the entrance a little bit wider to get his head out. But as he was working really, really hard and laboring to kind of dig this hole out, he was burning up the very limited amount of oxygen that was inside of this hole. And so very quickly, as he was trying to save himself, he would have started to struggle breathing because there just wasn't enough air in this hole. And so when it became clear he was starting to suffocate, he abandoned the approach of trying to dig himself out and began trying to contort his body outside of the hole at really extreme angles to try to pop his head out, even if it meant breaking his neck in the process. But no matter how hard he tried, he just could not get his head out. The following day, January 2nd at 4 p.m., this is after Stephen has been reported missing, a person walking through that forested park, they found Stephen. They saw his body poking out of that hole at a really extreme angle, and so they called the police. The police showed up to the park, and they confirmed that Stephen was dead. He had suffocated. His death was not ruled a suicide. It was determined to be an accident. As for Stephen's dog and his ferrets, they were found near his body, and they were unhurt. The next and final story of today's episode is called My Brother's Keeper. Just after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his 4-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic Fifth Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer. He was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the second floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors, or police officers, or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed, and then finally at 2 a.m. he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster and he got the things he was looking for and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived. And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact that there were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it. And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the two brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off, but instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them, and when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside. Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door. And pretty quickly, the door gave way. But it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the 2nd floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the 2nd floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the 2nd floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time. He could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically, all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the 2nd floor, 1st, 3rd, 4th, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling in trash. Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, and of course they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere. And lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open. Based on that big clue, here is the leading theory about what happened to Homer and Langley Collier. back on March 9th, 1947, so the night that Langley had snuck out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn, where he went dumpster diving, well, he wasn't just dumpster diving to find new treasures to bring back to the mansion to stuff inside. Instead, he was actually looking for something really specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges, like the fruit. And this particular dumpster in Brooklyn was right behind a store that sold fruit, and so there were always lots of oranges in this dumpster. Langley was actually trying his very best to take care of his older brother Homer. He had actually begun doing research using his father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. Lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster, and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, he maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day, as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, he accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. And so Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him. But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was a skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead bodies, and so he called it in. 4 months after Homer and Langley were found dead inside of their maze of trash, their mansion was declared a fire hazard and demolished. Today, there is a small park called the Collier Brothers Park, and it's filled with nothing but a couple of trees and a bench. In 2005, Todd Geib was 22 years old. He lived in Michigan. He was an avid outdoorsman. He liked to go deer hunting. He loved to catch trophy fish, and he loved his family. And routinely, after he moved out of the house, he would drive on the weekends the 5 miles north to his parents' house and would spend lots of time with his parents and his extended family. On June 11th, 2005, Todd was visiting his parents at their house. He was there for dinner, and after dinner, he went back to his house. He checked in with his roommate, who was actually his cousin, and then following that, he drove to a local bar to get a few drinks. At about 9:30 that night, he decides to leave the bar and walk to this big orchard where there was this huge annual keg party that he and his friends would go to. He leaves his car at the bar and he walks to this orchard, and it's perfect weather. All of his friends are there. He's having this great time, and he's there all the way until midnight. It was getting late. Todd felt tired, so he told a couple of his friends that he was going to head home. He was going to leave his car at the bar, and he was just going to walk back to his house. The area that this orchard was in was right near his home, and so he knew this area extremely well, and it was only about a mile south to walk to his house. So all of his friends said bye to him. They said he seemed totally normal. They watched him walk south towards his house, and that was the last anybody saw of him. On his walk home, Todd would make 4 phone calls to friends and to family. And the last one he made was at about 12:45 in the morning, and it was to his friends, and he told them that he was in a field and he couldn't breathe. And they kept asking him, like, what are you talking about? And all they heard was very heavy breathing on the phone. They couldn't tell if it was his or if someone else had taken the phone and was now breathing into it. Then the phone cuts out and they try calling him back, and there was no answer. They couldn't get in touch with him. The next day, when Todd did not show up at a family get-together, something he never would have missed unless he told them ahead of time, his family knew something was wrong. Plus, they had those strange phone calls the night before. They checked in with his friends. They said, yeah, we haven't heard from him. They went over to his house. He wasn't there. And so that's when they called the police. A massive search is kicked off involving canines and helicopters, and they're not finding anything. 3 weeks after Todd had gone missing, a couple was walking around this lake that was located north of the orchard where Todd was at that big keg party. And the wife looked out into the water and she said she thought she saw something bobbing. She couldn't tell what it was, but it was just this weird object that stood out to her. And she and her partner walked down to the edge of the lake and they looked out. And at first she thought it was a person who was swimming, just kind of bobbing up and down because their body position was such that their shoulders and head were totally out of the water. And so it was a strange sight, and they knew that it didn't seem right. So they called the police. Police show up, and it turns out that this person was Todd Geib, and they were deceased. When searchers found out that it was Todd Geib in the lake, their reaction was, no way. We have witnesses saying he was walking south after he left the keg party. Why is he in a lake way to the north of the keg party? It's in the complete opposite direction. Also, investigators were baffled at his body position because if he was a drowning victim, you would expect him to be face down in the water, as most drowning victims are. But for him to be upright, shoulders out of the water, it doesn't make any sense unless there's ice in the water to kind of prop him up. And there wasn't any ice in the water. His toxicology report showed that in addition to alcohol in his system, he had a very high dose of an antidepressant, something that he wasn't prescribed, and he didn't have any history of mental illness and had never been prescribed any antidepressant in his life. His body was pristine. It did not have any of the hallmarks, the bloating you would expect from being in water for 21 days. In fact, it was concluded that it was impossible for his body to have been in the water for all 21 days that he had been missing. His autopsy showed that he had almost no water in his lungs, even though his death was classified as an accidental drowning. When the news broke that this was an accidental drowning, the family and friends pushed for a closer examination of this case because it wasn't adding up. And so a noted pathologist looked at all of the evidence and determined that at most, Todd had been in the water for maybe 3 days, and he had almost certainly been deceased when he was placed in the water, which is why there wasn't any water in his lungs, and it's potentially why he was in that position that he was in, that upright position. Why are we calling it an accidental drowning still? And where was Todd from the day he went missing for those 15 to 17 days before he was placed in the water? And what did he mean when he was on the phone the night he went missing and said he was in a field and couldn't breathe? And what was all that breathing in the background? Lots of questions on this one. Our next story is called 40 Years Later. One of the most remote places in the world is Buldir Island in Alaska. It's 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away. The weather on Buldir Island is pretty brutal, especially during the winter, and there's no electricity there. In 1944, the United States Army decided they wanted to send 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Buldir Island. That was like the one thing the island was used for. And so one of the people that was sent on this assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was born in Wisconsin and worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate Alaskan island really appealed to him, and he was excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Buldir Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers that were going to be living on the island with him. It was going to be those 5 on the island. No one else is there. And they quickly learned their job of monitoring the weather station was a very low effort job. And so they could do all of their tasks over the course of the day pretty easily, and it freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. And so very quickly they became very familiar with the whole island because it wasn't that big. It was about maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, so 5 months after they've arrived on Buldir Island, so by now they know every square inch of the island, they're very comfortable here, they had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so very routine. And all 5 of them are sitting in the weather station, and Bud says he'll do it. So Bud gets his rifle, and he heads outside to do this patrol. And the other 4 are just sitting in the weather station, and after about an hour, they realize Bud hasn't come back yet. And this patrol does not take more than 20 minutes. And so they step outside to see if he's out there, and the weather at the time was very mild. You know, there's no snow on the ground, it's not very cold, it's not very windy, and the visibility this night was pretty good. And so they're looking out over the island, and the island has no trees. At the very far end, at the opposite end of where the weather station is, there's one significant sized mountain. But short of that, it's not particularly mountainous. So from their perspective, they could look out over the island and basically see everything. And they don't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it because they figure, you know what, he knows what he's doing. He's been here so long. He's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they would go look for him. They go down to the water. He's not down there. They walk all around the far side of the island. They can't find him. And so by the time they get back to the weather station, they were like, we have to tell the command that we've lost him. So they radio back to higher command and they say, we don't know where he went. He went out on patrol and we didn't hear anything. And now he's gone. And so a whole bunch of reinforcements came out to the island to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers, as well as planes and helicopters. And for 2 days, they looked all over that island for Bud, and they couldn't find him. And you got to remember that there's very few places you could possibly even go on the island that they wouldn't be able to look and see you. And so everyone started to think he must have jumped into the water or fallen into the water because there's nowhere for him to hide on the island. And so after a couple of days, they were so sure that it was just not possible for him to be on the island that they called the search off and they said he must have fallen into the water. Fast forward 40 years to 1988, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was studying birds on Buldir Island, and they made this amazing discovery. This crew had set up their camp at 1,600 feet of elevation on the one large mountain on the far side of the island, basically on the opposite end of the island from the weather station. And one of the crew members happened to just walk around one of the boulders, and they looked down and there was this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground, and he thought he saw something inside of it. And he got down and he looked and he realized there was a skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny little tight space. And the skeleton had a military uniform on. It had been kind of balled up, but there was a uniform on what was left of the skeleton, and there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. And it would turn out to be Bud Houston. So why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do that patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that and then walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,500 feet to the top of this mountain? But even if he had a reason to be over there, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter, well, the weather was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even that second night. And he knows the island like the back of his hand. He probably had a little bit more time. He probably could have found a better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a place where he was seeking shelter under these boulders instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real shelter, then he had to have been in an emergency situation. That's the only way that makes sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility is not just to survive, it's also to be found again and to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place to be found. There's no trees. There was helicopters overhead and planes, and there's all these people. It's a small space. All he had to do was not be under the boulder 24/7. Maybe during the day when the weather let up, roll out from under the boulder, let yourself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself, so someone else had to do it. But all the other people on the island were in the weather station at the time this would have been happening. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see, and what did they do to him? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. The next and final story of today's episode is called Acid Trip. On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat and smashed his toy cars together in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. Juan was so excited he could barely sit still. He always wanted to go for a ride in his dad's big truck. His dad was a long-haul trucker, but his dad always said no. But Juan had just gotten his best report card ever, and so as a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. And then once they got there, Juan's dad would offload the cargo that he had driven there. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it, going to the beaches and checking out the beautiful pastures where all the cows would graze. I mean, Juan was super excited. Juan's dad pulled the truck into this big lot with all these other trucks around, and then Juan's dad turned around and began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000-liter tanker that was covered in all these stickers and warning labels, and, Juan's father didn't know what this tanker actually contained, but he could tell, whatever it was pretty dangerous and also very important. And so as Juan's dad is backing up skillfully to line up with this tanker, Juan is just sitting in the back seat, absolutely transfixed at how cool his dad is. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing Juan had ever seen. And so finally, Juan's dad successfully hitched the truck to the tanker. And so once they were all hooked up, Juan's father yelled out the window and said bye to the people he worked with. And then Juan's father put in Juan's favorite tape cassette into the stereo and turned the music up. And then he turned onto the road and began making his way toward the highway. Juan's dad would drive basically all night, and Juan and his mother would basically sleep all night. But they would wake up at about 5 a.m. when Juan's father pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was located just north of the city of Madrid, Spain. They were making great time, so Juan's father told his family they could take their time eating. When the family did finish their meals, they got up and began walking out towards the truck, and little Juan, he turned around and he waved to the waitresses, and they all waved back. And then the family climbed back into Juan's father's truck, and then before long, Juan was curled up in the back seat trying to fall asleep again as his father merged onto the highway and began heading towards the stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Soma Sierra Mountain Pass was just driving along when suddenly a huge red tractor-trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, shining their lights into his car. And so this man, he sees this truck approaching so quickly, and he tried to get out of the way, but there was nowhere to go, and the truck wasn't stopping, it was honking its horn, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road, but luckily it did not tumble all the way down the mountain. And so this guy's car comes to a stop on the side of the road, and the guy, he kind of comes to, and he feels himself, he's worried he's got a serious injury. He did find a little blood on his head, but overall, he felt he was okay. And then he managed to get his door open and he climbed out of his car and he looked a little ways down the road and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side and it was hissing steam and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. Now, even though this guy was pretty shaken up from the crash he had just gotten into, he felt like he was definitely in better shape than whoever was in this truck. And so he decided he would just go up there and try to help them. But after only taking a few steps, this white van came blazing around the corner and came to a screeching stop on the road right next to where this guy was. And then before the guy could do anything, the sliding door to the van flung open and this woman with blonde hair jumped out and she ran over to him and she said, "I'm a nurse. Do you need any help?" And so this guy, he's looking at this woman and he's kind of sizing her up and she did not seem like a nurse. And in fact, for some reason, this guy felt like she just made him really uncomfortable. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he looked past this woman at the van and he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, but he also had very bright blonde hair and he had these striking blue eyes that really stood out even from a distance. And then in the passenger seat of this van was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy who's now talking to this nurse who's right next to him. And so the guy's looking at the old woman and the old woman's looking right back and she really looked mean, like she was not happy to be talking to him. And so the guy finally just said to this woman who was claiming to be a nurse that, "You know what? I don't need any help. Go help them. They need help because they haven't gotten out of the truck yet." The woman just nodded and then she ran back to the van, hopped inside, and the van sped, the 100 feet down the road to where the crashed big red tractor trailer truck was. And again, the woman hopped out and she rushed over to the truck and she climbed on top of it and she reached down and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, the guy who had also crashed, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. But after she took whatever she took, she climbed off the cab. She did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck. She jumped back in the white van and the white van sped off down the road and they were gone. The guy barely had time to process what had just happened before he began to smell this unbelievably powerful rotten egg smell. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor-trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. And that rotten egg smell they were smelling in the area meant the air was now becoming toxic as the sulfuric acid leaked out and began interacting with the ground and making its way into the nearby river. So before anybody could even go inside of this truck to see if there were survivors, they had to basically cover it and the surrounding areas with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand and lime to try to counteract the acid. It would take hours to do this, and in that time, nobody came out of the truck's cab. And then finally, when emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only two bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Now, one of the theories was, well, when this crashed, maybe the sulfuric acid landed on Juan's body somehow and literally dissolved him, and so that's why he was not found. But that's not possible because it would take much, much longer for sulfuric acid to totally eat away someone's body. And the body would have to be fully submerged in the acid the entire time. So that could not have happened. Rescuers would search the entire area deep into the woods in all directions, looking for signs of this child, but there were none. And when investigators attempted to recreate this accident to try to figure out what actually caused it and why it happened, what they would learn would only confuse them more. Juan's father's truck had nothing wrong with it mechanically. Meaning the brakes weren't messed up, the accelerator wasn't messed up. There really was no reason why this truck should have crashed unless it was intentional. That's the only way this could have happened. Also, the truck contains something called a tachometer, which registers every time the truck slows down or stops. And when investigators looked at the record from this tachometer, they discovered that Juan's father had slowed down or stopped 12 different times between leaving the diner and crashing. But the route from the diner to the crash site was a straight shot with no traffic lights or stop signs. Basically, there had been no reason from the diner to the crash site to ever slow down or stop. But again, Juan's father did 12 separate times. And then also there were traces of heroin that were found in a hidden compartment in Juan's father's truck. Now, Juan's parents had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to drugs or the cartel, but investigators did consider a theory that, perhaps a drug cartel ambushed Juan and his family, and ultimately Juan was kidnapped. But there was one more really strange element to Juan's disappearance, and that was that white van that guy saw right after the crash. Multiple people in the area around the Somosierra Mountain Pass said they saw that exact white van because they all remembered the woman and the man who had that same really bright blonde hair. It just was something that was kind of unique and stood out. But the police tried to track down this van and the man and the woman and the elderly woman who was also claimed to have been seen inside the van, but no trace of that van was ever found. And also, police were never able to figure out what that woman actually took from inside of Juan's father's cab before they sped off and disappeared. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain, and almost immediately, loads of sightings were reported of Juan. But every time the police followed up on these sightings, they never panned out. Interpol, which is a major international police organization, called Juan's disappearance one of the strangest disappearances in all of Europe. 1 year after the crash, so in 1987, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, was filling out some paperwork in his office when he heard a knock on the door. When he answered the door, he found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? And he watched as the elderly woman turned and whispered something into the little boy's ear, and the driving instructor, he could hear her whispering, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. It sounded like a foreign language. And in fact, it would turn out they figured out she was speaking Farsi, which is the language spoken in Iran. The little boy listened to the elderly woman, and then after hearing what she had to say, he turned to the driving instructor and he asked in perfect Spanish, "Where's the US Embassy?" The instructor gave them directions, and then the little boy nodded, and then he and the elderly woman, they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and they began walking away. And as they walked away, the driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these two people. And so he flagged them down and he said, "Come back for a second." And so the boy and the woman, they came back, and the driving instructor, he asked the boy, he said, "Do you live in Spain? And if you do, how long have you lived here for?" And when he asked the boy this, the boy immediately looked really afraid. And then the elderly woman, she turned and she whispered something else into the boy's ear. And then after she was done talking, the boy kind of settled down and he looked at the driving instructor and he said, 6 months. And for some reason, at this exact moment, the driving instructor realized why this boy seemed so familiar. He remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters all over the place. And so the driving instructor, he couldn't remember the boy's name. And he goes, "Hold on a minute." He turns and he runs inside of his office and he finds one of the posters that said Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them and be like, "Hey, they're looking for you." But when the driving instructor came back to the front door, the boy and the blind old woman were gone. And so the driving instructor, he stepped out, he's looking around, he's yelling out for them. They were gone. Now, it's important to understand that to this day, no sightings of Juan have ever been confirmed, and that includes the driving instructor who claimed to have seen Juan. But to this day, Juan's body has never been found, he's still missing, and his case is still unsolved. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballin Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious